So after the first Scream lit the horror world on fire in 1996 and became a huge runaway box office hit, the studio wanted a sequel and they wanted it fast. So with only a year to turn it all around and nothing but a 5-page outline before production started, could Scream 2 ever really capture that lightning in a bottle, sharp satirical wit of its predecessor? Yeah, actually, it's pretty good. Following very quickly in the footsteps of the first film, Scream 2 went into production while that original movie was still in cinemas. With no time to even so much as breathe in their prior success, the filmmakers and cast had a hell of a time making this sequel. Of course, the schedule had to be extremely rushed, and to make matters worse, an almost completed working script was leaked onto the internet and revealed the film's killers, which caused a huge headache for everyone involved, as pretty much the whole thing had to be rewritten throughout production, and pages were sometimes completed on the day they would be filmed.
And then Kevin sent us, I think something like 30 pages by email. We read it, it was fabulous. It was on the internet in its entirety that night. And all of you little fuckers out there that think that's really cute, you fucking ruined our next 3 months.
By all accounts, the process of getting Scream 2 to the big screen on such a tight deadline while also working around the leaks was an extremely stressful nightmare. So it probably would have been a safe bet when all circumstances were considered that the film would fall flat. Had you somehow been following its development over the year, I imagine it was probably a fair expectation to assume this would have went the way of most slasher sequels. A quick cash grab, thrown together at the last minute when they realised their IP name had huge franchise potential and they could sell a series on name and the success of the original alone. Against all odds though, Scream 2 kinda slaps. Opening on the incredibly brilliant and incredibly meta idea of the tragedies of the first film having been tastelessly milked into a large multimedia franchise coming off the back of Courtney Cox's character Gail's sensationalist book, The Woodsboro Murders. We're greeted with two new characters, a couple named Phil and Maureen at the premiere of this new movie called Stab. Love that. Such a perfect parody title for Scream. It could honestly have been an alternate name for the franchise. Scream is the better name, but still, Stab's a solid plan B. While in the queue for the movie, the two characters have some back and forth cute little bickering as Maureen wanted to see the new Sandra Bullock film, but Phil won some free tickets to Stab, and they're all very likeable, and they make some keen observations on the general fates of characters of colour within horror movies, but don't get too attached because they naturally aren't going to make it past the opening credits. In a scene that really interestingly explores the sometimes absurd relationship between audiences in the horror genre, the two enter an absolute nightmare of a theatre, packed to the rim with rowdy patrons, many of which are wielding prop knives and masks in tribute to their favourite real-life serial killer, whom they cheer for whenever they're on screen, just as audiences of the past would root for the likes of Freddy and Jason. The film then cuts cleverly between our couple in the audience and the events of the Stab movie on screen, which plays out like a shot-for-shot remake of the first film's events with new actors, only now with added nudity, in a sly dig at sensationalist horror's over-reliance on cheap titillation. While at the cinema, our newly introduced couple are eventually killed by an unknown assailant, disguising themselves amongst the crowd by wearing the same serial killer garb that decorated the first film's murders and now most of the audience. In a really quite chilling effective ender to this sequence, Maureen stumbles her way to the front of the screen, and as she screams in anguish, she bleeds out in front of the audience, all decorated in her killer's visage. I really love the way that as some of the audience members realise what's going on, they remove their masks, as if they don't want to be a part of this celebration of violence when confronted with the reality with which it's based on. Honestly, if I didn't know any better, I'd think director Wes Craven wrote this scene and not screenwriter Kevin Williamson, as it feels very much like the natural evolution of the commentary he was making in New Nightmare. If you haven't watched my video on that already, check it out after this one and you'll see what I mean. It's appropriate that he's the director for this franchise, as it's very much in his wheelhouse after his Elm Street 7 work. After this new couple's deaths, we cut to Windsor College, where they used to attend classes, and where seniors and returning cast Sidney Prescott and Randy Meeks still do. There's a great little acknowledgement of how prepared for and done with this shit Sidney is when she gets a call from a stranger doing the Ghostface voice, but instead of reacting terrified, she just reads them their caller ID. Sidney ain't got time for this nonsense. Especially when news of the cinema slayings reaches the college and the press, including First Film's infamous reporter Gail Weathers, who all descend upon the scene with fervour, ready for the latest scoop. Fearing these killings are related to her past, Sidney confides in her new friend and roommate Hallie, her new boyfriend Derek, his best friend Mickey, and a returning Officer Dewey who came out to check up on her after the news of the murders hit. And of course, fellow Woodsboro survivor and old friend and classmate Randy, who in one of my favourite little character developments now studies film. Because of course he does. As someone who studied film in college and then went to university and got both a bachelor's degree and a master's in the subject, I've done a fair few film modules, and I can promise you that every film course you will ever take has a Randy on it. In his class, Randy is of course a smart-mouthed know-it-all who thinks because he recognises a couple of tropes in a genre that he is somehow God's gift to film analysis, and can make generalised statements like all sequels are by definition inferior movies, with barely anything to back it up besides a smirk and a disagreement with anyone who would challenge him on the matter. Great character, very believable, very grounded, and very perfectly teenage in his understanding of movies, but boy is he irritatingly familiar if you've ever had to sit through someone trying to argue that, say, the plot holes in Toy Story make it a bad movie. Plus, what he says next, I simply cannot forgive.
Aliens is a classic, okay? Get away from her, you bitch.
I believe the line is stay away from her, you bitch. It's film class, right?
No, Randy! It is get away from her, you bitch! Your classmate was right, you knob! In fairness to Jamie Kennedy here, I have heard that during this take the classmate said the wrong line, and thinking on his feet so as to not stall the scene, Jamie Kennedy replied with the erroneous line to keep the scene going. After all, they could have used takes of dialogue from later in the sequence that they might have missed out on if Jamie had stopped. Not sure how or why this made it into the final cut though, but whatever, I'm not really offended, it's just a little odd. You could always argue though that it's a clever way of showing Randy isn't the expert on films he thinks he is, I suppose, and that this foreshadows his death when he makes the seemingly out of character horror movie mistake of backing up towards a darkened van. Like, I feel like that's exactly the kind of thing that Randy would shout at horror movie characters for, but hey, if the lad can't quote aliens, maybe he isn't quite the pop cultural font of knowledge we thought he is. Anyway, as the bodies pile up, it seems like the killer is out to make a real-life sequel, with Sidney being the ultimate target. So it's up to Sidney and her few friends who can survive this second attack, R.I.P. Randy, to get to the bottom of who this new copycat killer or killers are, all while being stalked and taunted by this mystery person along the way. And with so many suspects, like Sid's new boyfriend, the medical student whose attack from the killer conveniently missed every major artery, or the entitled Cotton, a face from Sid's past who wrongly served a year in prison for Sid's mother's murder on Sid's testimonial, or even her very friends she once knew she could rely on but who seem to have all converged on the area with a convenient excuse to be there just as the murders began, it won't be easy to know who to trust. It's a brilliant mystery that's engaging throughout and packed with a bunch of fun horror set pieces, like an excellent theatre scene where Ghostface blends with dramatic flair into the other masked performers, a great tense sequence of Gail being chased around the college after hours that plays with elements like soundproof glass, cameras, and an almost labyrinthine layout, and a nerve-shredding sequence where Sidney and Haley have to climb over the unconscious body of their would-be killer to get out of a crashed police car. The meta-commentary on the genre is once again richly on display, tackling a whole host of new concepts such as the nature of sequels, the ethics of cinematic violence and true crime, media scapegoating, and the pursuit of celebrity. Cotton's desperate and single-minded quest for building fame on the back of his and Sidney's trauma is a great new antagonistic force that ties into the film's ending and its themes in a compelling way. The killer's motives, though I won't reveal them because while not as great as the originals, are still thematically interesting, cleverly foreshadowed in all manner of fun tongue-in-cheek ways, and the reveal lands in a satisfying manner I think should probably be witnessed firsthand. Plus, the journey we take to get to this solid conclusion is once again bursting with great characters and dialogue that once more showcases Kevin Williamson's finger on the pulse mindset when it comes to writing horror and characters for a whole new generation. It's another smart, subversive, and deeply satirical look at a beloved but occasionally tired genre that continues Scream's trend of pumping new life into horror's old veins. And that's Scream 2. But here's the thing. This is an extremely solid slasher movie. Everything it does works. It's engaging, the characters are great, it still has that sharp meta commentary throughout. It's a good, fun film. However, for me, it commits one unfortunate cardinal sin. It follows Scream 1. It was always going to be impossible to make a film like Scream again, and although Scream 2 makes an incredibly earnest attempt and does enough with its new material and characters to keep audiences entertained and engaged throughout, the simple fact of the matter is that Scream was revolutionary and Scream 2 is not. It is an effect of that revolution, flames and smoke in the afterburn of it, not the spark that started it. It's like hearing the same joke twice. It could be the funniest thing you've ever heard the first time round, but it's never going to land quite as well that second time. There are many that argue it's actually the superior movie. And while I'm all for heaping critical praise on this thing, because I do think Scream 2 deserves its time in the spotlight, I gotta say, better than the first? I'm sorry, I just don't see that. The original Scream was as tight as could be. It's a straight up perfect movie. Its red herrings were super believable, its characters were great, its performances memorable, its opening iconic, its concept smart and unique, but most importantly, it was new. It's impossible for every meta horror that follows Scream's huge impact on the genre to not somehow exist in the shadow of this giant, and that applies to even its own sequels. Much like every slasher ever owes some debt of gratitude to Psycho and Peeping Tom, so does every meta horror have some Scream DNA. Yeah, Wes Craven's New Nightmare came out earlier and did similar things, but that took a far more surreal and artsy approach compared to Scream's very MTV but otherwise grounded in mainstream narrative. And sure, Jason Lives was doing the horror satire jokes even earlier than that and would itself be a huge influence on Kevin Williamson when he wrote Scream, but its meta commentary was relegated to the occasional witty line and fun wink at the audience rather than almost entirely its central conceit. No matter which way you cut it and no matter what came before it, Scream cemented itself as the beloved granddaddy of meta horror. It's the one that had the impact, it's the one that saved mainstream horror and made it palatable again to a wide audience. It's the one that had the huge influence on so much of the genre that followed. Let's not forget that we know the messy Jason X got notes back on its script saying to make it more like Scream. How many times do you think a script got notes back saying, hey, can we make this more like Wes Craven's New Nightmare? As great as that film was, I'm willing to bet the answer to that question is almost definitely none. I'm not saying Scream marks the subgenre as done and dusted. There are ways to make slasher and horror meta commentary fresh for sure. Leslie Vernon's 2006 mockumentary approach still felt wholly unique 10 years after Ghostface hit our screens, and I bloody love 2011's Cabin in the Woods, but even with those films, there's no denying they all owe a debt of gratitude to Ghostface's debut. And while those films can shine on their own merit, being that they're standalone titles from different creators that came out years later, Scream 2 always has the caveat of being the named connection and immediate sequel to that first movie. Every single recommendation of Scream 2 often comes with the additional comparison to its prior film. It's always, Scream 2's great, you should definitely watch that. Not as good as Scream 1, but still really good. Does it do enough of its own thing to be considered a volume worth watching alongside that former film? Absolutely. Its skewering of horror sequels feels like the perfect companion piece to the former's twists, homages and subversions of slasher tropes, and there's so many more great unique things to point to that make this so much more than just the second Scream. The way it examines our relationship with horror movies by having an in-universe adaptation of the first film's incredible tragedies be a hugely popular hit is phenomenal stuff. Its discussion around the moral panics of media's responsibilities and scapegoating status when it comes to national tragedies, brilliant. Its unique horror set pieces, like the protagonists having to climb over an unconscious killer in the claustrophobic crashed car while contemplating whether to remove his mask and possibly disturb him and endanger themselves. Awesome. Love it. The theatre performance Wes added in during rewrites, spine-tinglingly good. The mystery, the foreshadowing, the multiple red herrings, the new characters, the old characters who get new ways of being further fleshed out, it's all brilliant stuff. And it's all new and unique to this entry. The problem is, in amongst all of those noteworthy additions, is a lot of stuff that only on the second entry into this franchise still manages to feel a bit like a Scream tribute act. The big chilling opening sequence where a couple unrelated to the main cast are killed to set the tone and scene, it's great, but not as good as Scream 1's. The meta commentary on the various horror movie tropes, yeah, it's awesome. Not as good as when Scream 1 did it though. The central mystery and the final reveal of who the killers are, as well as the performance from the killers themselves, yeah, brilliant stuff. But no prizes for guessing what I'm going to say next. It's not as good as when Scream 1 did it. I honestly feel really bad comparing Scream 2 so unfavourably to that first film because it is really good. And in terms of thinking about Scream 2 as a slasher sequel, it is one of the best there is. Comparing it to every other second film I'm covering this month, that is to say Nightmare 2, Halloween 2 and Friday 2, Scream 2 is by far the superior film to all of those franchise entries, and it's honestly not even close. However, it has a problem they do not. Firstly, it's following one of the greatest horror films of all time. Unlike the second Friday the 13th, that film can get away with having a similar film again because it never had ambitions beyond forgettable popcorn escapism anyway. And Nightmare 2 and Halloween 2 may be hugely inferior step downs from their first entries, but they're also hugely different, so don't remotely invite those comparisons as much. Nightmare 2 took a totally different angle with a possession storyline, and Halloween 2 dropped the subtlety and tension building dread of its first film in favour of more gory popcorn fare. Scream 2 though is still very much a Scream film. For all its refreshingly unique elements, it can often feel like it's hitting the key beats of a formula. Despite only being the second movie to have that formula, it's still a whodunit with a two-killer reveal, it's still got the let's pause and talk about the rules moment, it's still got the Dewey and Gale romance, and it's still got the almost standalone short film-like structure to its pre-title sequence. To quote one of the first movie's villains, it's a Scream, baby. And maybe the problem is with me. I should, after all, judge it on its own merit. And I certainly do to some extent. I'll say it time and time again, it's a really great film. I just can't help myself enjoying those comparisons because it often feels like the film is inviting them. Perhaps that's actually the smartest thing it does in the end. This film is, after all, poking fun at the idea of horror sequels. Maybe this is just another clever tool in its repertoire. As Randy puts it, in horror sequels, the body count is always bigger, the death scenes are always more elaborate, and it certainly hits those notes. Maybe this bigger, badder, but not quite better sequel is in itself the final skewering of the trend of the bigger, badder, but not quite better sequels of the past. Maybe. Or maybe it's just a really good film that isn't quite as good as the last one. I don't know, but what I do know is that you shouldn't let any of my negative comparisons colour your perception of it because Scream 2 still rules. Anyway, with that in the bag, we're now halfway through this franchise, but there's still 2 more to go. So please, if you enjoyed this video, let me know with a like and a comment, and subscribe to my Only Dans at the red button below and hit the bell so you don't miss me tackling Scream 3. Other than that, I'll be signing off now, so as always, I've been Dan Rambles, you're watching Wholesome Halloween 2 Slasher Season, and I will see you tomorrow.